Welcome back to some more MP Madness with Dr. H, and what we're going to be doing in this particular video is finishing up acid-base balance. I am going to try to teach you guys how to compensate for acid-base balance. In other words, if you have a patient that's going through acidosis, or if you have a patient that's going through alkalosis, how can you determine whether or not they have acidosis versus alkalosis, and what will their bodies be doing to try to fix the problem? How can we start to predict what some of the diagnostic tools are going to be? It's pretty cool that we can actually do this based off of the physiology that we've learned. So the very first thing that we need to try to remember about acid-base balances is that the body's normal pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Anything less than 7.35 is considered acidosis. Anything greater than 7.45 is considered alkalosis. And how's the body going to start to compensate for these the second that, say for instance, the blood pH drops below 7.35? The very first thing that's in our blood all the time, just hanging out there, product of metabolic reactions, our body preparing the blood for acids, well, we have buffers, okay? The very first compensatory mechanism that we have in our body are buffers. So what's the first system that's going to start to work? 100% of the time, buffers are going to start to work, right? And what are buffers going to do? Buffers are going to either release a hydrogen or they're going to pick up hydrogens. Just depends on what the buffer is, and it depends on which direction we're going. So now if we have a patient that's going through acidosis, there are too many hydrogens. What are buffers going to be trying to do in that scenario? Buffers are going to try to pull those hydrogens out of solution. It's a pretty simple idea. And what primary buffer do we have in the system to do that? We have bicarbonate. That's the primary buffer that's in the system. So if we were to say we have a bicarbonate reserve, right? That's always, and actually let's use a different color because I can and I like colors. So let's say we have a bicarbonate reserve, which is just hanging out in the bloodstream, right? And what do we have? We have bicarb. Now, typically bicarb is bound to something. Our body makes a lot of sodium bicarb, for instance. But when sodium bicarb gets into water, it's going to dissociate. And this is a reversible reaction depending on how much water is in the system. This is going to dissociate into a sodium and it's going to dissociate into a bicarb, right? Sodium ion and a bicarb ion. Bicarb is what we're really after here. So after we leave the reserve, what we're going to be adding to the blood is just a bunch of bicarb. So I hope that makes sense, right? And we can add back to the reserve. So we're going to have this arrow go either direction. But ultimately what we're after is this HCO3 minus. So now we got some bicarb in the system. Awesome. So in the acidotic state that we were defining before, right? If we have a patient with acidosis, what do we have a lot of in the body? We have a lot of hydrogens. And so as bicarbs are found in the blood, as they go across hydrogen ions, the hydrogen ions will bind themselves up onto those bicarbs. And what are we going to be left with? Right? We're going to be left with a whole bunch of H2, a little ionic bond happens right here, CO3. No pluses or minuses, and this is carbonic acid. What can the body actually do with this? Oddly enough, right, we have something that we can do with this if we so choose, and this will be important, and actually important enough that I'm going to add it in one more color of blue, and lots of different colors of blues. Right? If we have a whole bunch of what's called carbonic anhydrase, like we do in erythrocytes, for instance, what is going to happen to this? It's going to turn into water and carbon dioxide. And now we can do something with that carbon dioxide, can't we? And just to show you guys how the chemistry works, Remember, if CO2 levels are super duper high, what direction is this entire equation going to go? It's going to start to move this way. So what are we going to produce a lot of as we have too much CO2, carbonic acid, and we're going to be releasing hydrogens in the system? It's kind of an interesting play, right? The great thing about the bicarbonate reserve and buffer system is we have two different buffers here. We have a bicarb buffer and we have the carbonic acid buffer. So what if the body is too alkaline? Well, then we're going to start to have more carbonic acid releasing hydrogens. So we try to get more hydrogens than bicarb in that scenario. It's a really nice little system. And that's the first compensatory system that comes into play. There are other buffers in the human body, and it's important to note that there are other buffers in the human body. For instance, there are protein buffers. Okay, bicarbonate reserve is just one type of buffer system, but we have other types of buffer systems as well. And we're going to I need this room down here. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say another type of buffer that's in the system are protein buffers. And protein buffers, yeah, we don't necessarily want hydrogens binding to proteins because they denature those proteins. But as long as they denature those proteins, then it's pulling those hydrogens out of solution, right? So proteins can act as a buffer for hydrogen. Why? Because proteins are made up of amino acids, or an amine group, which is basic, and a carboxylic acid group, which is acidic. So a protein can actually bind up hydrogens on the amine side, but it can release hydrogens on the carboxylic acid side. So proteins are a pretty good source of buffer, both the base buffer and the acid buffer. Another potential buffer that's in the body is hemoglobin. We know hemoglobin. We've seen it before. Hemoglobin's found on erythrocytes, all around them, right? And it binds up oxygen and CO2 and carbon monoxide as well. But we also know hemoglobin binds hydrogens. So as it binds those hydrogens up, it acts as a base buffer. Okay, it's a weak base buffer that's binding up those hydrogens. Nice. The last one is found in the kidneys. It's a phosphate buffer group. Phosphate buffer group. And that's kind of all that I'm going to be referring to it. Phosphate. That's not how you spell phosphate. There we go. So there's a phosphate buffer system as well, where the kidneys are producing monosodium phosphate or disodium phosphate, and monosodium phosphate is going to bind with bases, so it is in essence an acid, and disodium phosphate is going to bind with acids, so it's in essence a base, right? Anything that can accept or release, those are acids and bases, whether or not it's in the name or not. All right, so that's the first compensatory mechanism, buffers. Now, let's talk about the next compensatory mechanism. The second compensatory mechanism controls about 70% of all acid-base imbalances in the human body. About 70%. And if you listen to my videos before, you might already know the answer to what controls 70% of acid-base balance. What's the number one source of acid in the human body? Carbon dioxide. And what is the system that controls carbon dioxide levels in the human body? The respiratory system. The respiratory system is going to try to compensate for acids and bases, and it controls 70% of that acid-base imbalance. Why? Because the respiratory system controls CO2. So the second compensatory mechanism is the respiratory system, or respiratory compensation is what it's called. Okay, respiratory compensation. When we alter respiration, we could either increase or decrease our respiratory rate. We could either increase or decrease the depth of breath. Right? What do we know about the respiratory system? As just a brief review, it's all about pulmonary or alveolar ventilation, right? Pulmonary ventilation, where pulmonary ventilation was equal to the speed, the respiratory rate, the speed at which a person breathes, times the depth that they're breathing, tidal volume. And you can also look at alveolar ventilation, which takes into account dead space, but this is the easiest way to think about it. Okay, respiratory compensation. The respiratory system is all about let's get air in and out of the lungs. Let's get a particular volume of air in and out of the lungs over time. Don't overthink this. I'm not trying to make this too complicated. All I'm trying to say is if pulmonary ventilation were to increase, let's just go example, pulmonary ventilation were to increase, what do we know that would start to do? You're breathing faster and you're breathing heavier. What are we doing to the amount of carbon dioxide in the human body as we do that? Okay, if you start to breathe faster and deeper, you are breathing in more O2 and you're breathing out more CO2. So what happens to the amount of CO2 in the system? What happens to the amount of CO2 in the system when that happens? It starts to decrease. My little kid just came into my bedroom. Hi, bub. Go. You're good. Love you, kiddo. All right. So if there's a decrease in CO2, then we know that this decreases the total amount of acid that's in the system, right? So what's this going to start to do to the pH? Now the pH is going to be increasing because remember, pH and acidity are opposite of one another. Versus if we had an example where a patient had a decrease in that pulmonary ventilation, now they're breathing slower. So now we have an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that stays in the bloodstream, and their pH is going to start to drop because they're becoming more acidic, because the number one source of acid in the human body is carbon dioxide. Not too bad, right? This is respiratory compensation. It's all about CO2. I can't emphasize that enough. This is going to occur relatively fast. Buffers are the immediate response. We're talking, this is occurring within seconds, right? The buffers are just right there. They're already in the blood. They start to buffer against acid-base balances right off the bat. Whereas respiratory compensation, you're going to start breathing faster or slower fast, and it's going to start to help to fix the problem within minutes. This is going to take minutes to start to fix the problem. All right, what is the last thing that I really want to go after here? Last thing I really want to think about with respiratory compensation is that it's an important thing to note that if a patient has a respiratory disorder, then they have a CO2 imbalance based on that respiratory disorder. So anytime we're dealing with the respiratory system, what we're talking about is CO2 related problems, right? This is all about CO2. Respiratory system can really only fix CO2. So what if you have another source of acid? Maybe it's lactic acid or ketonic acid. Well, now we're still putting hydrogens into the blood and we can still get rid of more CO2, but we're doing that through a CO2 related mechanism, not by getting rid of the original source of the acid. So a respiratory system can help fix those problems. But what if it's a CO2 related problem? If the respiratory system is already broken, how can the respiratory system fix that problem? It can't. So because the respiratory compensation is all about CO2, if we have a CO2 related problem, the respiratory compensation is not going to be enough to fix that problem. I hope that made sense, and we're going to come back to that as well. All right, the last thing to consider is the last type of compensation. Now, the respiratory system controlled 70% of acid-base balances in terms of a system, how that works. Buffers is going to just immediately start to work. The other system now that's going to take over and do the other 30%? Well, what are we going to be doing with excess hydrogens if they're in our blood? We're going to pee them out. So that last system is going to be the renal system, right? We're going to have renal compensation. And renal compensation can take a lot of time. Respiratory system, we're talking minutes, I believe is what I said, right? This is fixing things in minutes. The renal compensation can take hours or days. So we're going to be dealing with renal compensation for a much longer period of time after the original acute problem. Renal compensation is going to last for a long, long time. And the way the renal compensation works is all related to transportation of hydrogens. And I mentioned this, I reviewed this in my acid-base balance 1 video. But when we're dealing with the renal system and the nephron, we should be looking at specific types of cells and specific types of transporters. And in the renal system, in the collecting duct and the DCT, what we have are called intercalated cells. And there are type A and type B intercalated cells. The type A intercalated cells are always, as long as type A's are active, they are always secreting and helping with the excretion of acid, trying to get rid of the hydrogens. And at the same time, they're helping with the reabsorption of bicarbs. Right? On the apical surface, we're secreting hydrogens. I'm going to have to do a different video for the actual structures that are involved in all that. I haven't done that video yet. But we're secreting hydrogens from the apical surface, and on the basolateral surface, we're going to be reabsorbing bicarbs, which is good if we had a patient with acidosis, right? Let's think about this. If we had a patient with acidosis, what does that tell you? What's going on with the blood hydrogen levels? If acidosis and that patient has an increase in the hydrogen in the plasma, right? We know that that's there. So what's the patient going to be trying to do? Pee that hydrogen out. It wants to get rid of that hydrogen however it can. So type A intercalated cells are going to secrete the hydrogen, and at the same time, as we reabsorb more bicarbs, these bicarbs are going to be binding up those hydrogens, right? So we increase the reabsorption of bicarbs, and they bind up those hydrogens, which is great, which is what we're after. This is if acidosis is in play, but this wouldn't help us if we had alkalosis, right? So that's what the other type of cell is all about. We have type B, and type B intercalated cells are constantly reabsorbing hydrogens and secrete bicarbs. They're doing the opposite because of the polarity of those intercalated cells. Their transporters are now going to be swapped. And therefore, type B are going to be helping with a patient that has alkalosis. So if a patient has alkalosis, their compensatory mechanism is going to say, let's increase the activity of type B intercalated cells. This is because there is a decrease in the amount of hydrogens in the plasma, and the body needs to bring that back up again, right? So what are we going to do? Let's bring more hydrogens. Let's reabsorb more hydrogens back into that plasma, and let's secrete. Let's get rid of the bicarbs that are binding it up. I hope that helps a few people out in terms of these three major types of compensatory mechanisms. This is how the body compensates. 1, 2, 3. It's going to be doing a balance of these three. The second acidosis occurs, buffers. Which buffers are going to come into play for acidosis? Any of these buffers that bind up hydrogens. Respiratory compensation. How is the respiratory system going to compensate if there is an increase in the number of acids? It's going to try to get rid of CO2, right? So if we have acidosis, then the respiratory system is going to increase pulmonary ventilation because that is going to try to get rid of CO2. And let's write that in. If acidosis, what do we know is going to happen? Well, the respiratory center, we can't forget about the neural reflexes, can we? The respiratory center, the DRG, dorsal respiratory groups, and VRG, ventral respiratory groups, those are going to be detecting those CO2-related acids, whereas the peripheral chemoreceptors are going to detect the rest of those acids. And because of that, it's going to increase the activity of the DRG, and it's going to increase both the respiratory rate and the tidal volume. And if we increase respiratory rate and tidal volume, what's going to happen? That's going to increase pulmonary ventilation. And then we can come back up here. If we increase pulmonary ventilation, we start to blow the CO2 out, trying to bring the pH back to normal because we originally had acidosis, right? Versus if we have alkalosis, nice, great thing about acid-base disorders is you're going to try to do the opposites of, right? Then there's less acid that's going to decrease the respiratory rate. That's going to decrease the tidal volume as well. And ultimately that decreases pulmonary ventilation. And now we're starting to retain more carbon dioxide, trying to make more acid. Because remember, if we retain more carbon dioxide, then we make more carbonic acid. If we make more carbonic acid, there's more hydrogens released into that solution. All right, that's the end of acid-base balance 2. And in acid-base balance 3, the last of these videos that I'm going to make for acid bases, what we're going to do is we're going to start to give some examples of patients with acid-base disorders. All right. See you guys for the next episode of AMP Madness. Talk to you later.